The truth is a cone. Different people hug different areas of the cone, and some are higher up so they can see further along than others. In medieval China, there was this concept of the three vinegar drinkers, in that Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu each tapped into underlying truths of reality, but came to different conclusions. For an example of what this means, studying how different civilizations view the world has really opened my mind. For example, in Indian philosophy, which is a worldview which has had as much thought put into it as the Western, they see all of reality as an illusion spun by the gods, called Lilaya or Maya. We really don't have any good historical records of India before foreign invaders like the Muslims or the British showed up, since in their worldview, reality is an illusion, thus not worth recording. Religion and spirituality is what's real in the Indian world. Alternately, the concept that there is a standardized time is very modern. In traditional African societies, time just doesn't exist. They don't have a concept for it. In pre-modern Chinese society, time moved at different rates depending on how it impacts the world. Thus, time moved fastest around the emperor since he was changing the course of history. Medieval Europe had 3 different kinds of time, which were all incompatible with the others. And although we can all agree that time now is real, this means that there are probably rules to the universe and underlying principles that are going on that we haven't noticed or we don't have words for. We didn't have a word for gravity until the 17th century. The reason I'm explaining all of this here is that something which separates us from our ancestors is that we can't even consider all the ways that our worldview is alien to theirs. Things as basic as a concept of what reality is, or what time is, are different. This means that when we're reading about ancient thinkers like Plato, Lao Tzu, or the alchemists, when they're saying something, we might hear the words, but we don't actually know what it means. At least from their perspective. This is since we're missing their mental context where their worldview makes total sense. It sounds silly to us since we don't know what argument they're actually making. The longer I've lived in my short life, I've come to the conclusion that the reality is more bizarre than any fiction could be. What would you say if I told you that historians have an irrefutable amount of evidence that the priest classes of the pre-modern world all saw the world vastly differently from how we do? That they kept these teachings in secret so only those who studied history and the world very deeply would know about them? That almost all of the figures in history, or important elite ones from the pre-industrial world, were deeply steeped in this tradition, in that it changed the course of history in ways difficult to even understand. This is what this video is about, the Western esoteric tradition. This is one of the most important rabbit holes in my life personally, and it's changed how I see the world on a profound level. I'm excited to share it with you guys. I hope it will be as meaningful to you as it was to me. Let's get started.
Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard the What-If-Altist guy, and these sorts of topics can feel overwhelmingly detailed and complex, and we're in for a bumpy ride. When dealing with really complex stuff, it's nice to have a guide to help you through everything. This is true for a handful of fields like finance or law, and Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm, and they're ready to fight for their clients. They have over 100 offices around the country, more than 1,000 lawyers, and 4,000 case staff ready to fight for you. Sometimes people are hesitant to sue due to expenses, but Morgan & Morgan only charges you if you win the case. There are no upfront costs, no sign-up fees. All the paperwork, research, experts, witnesses, negotiations, court hearings, it's all free unless you win. To repeat that, if you don't win your case, you pay nothing. When you're injured, you deserve compensation, and when you sue, it's an insurance company that's footing the bill, so the person you're suing won't be crushed by the financial burden. If you're ever injured, you can check out Morgan & Morgan through my special link, www.forthepeople.com/whatifaltist, found in the description, or by scanning the QR code on screen through your phone's camera. Peace.
Part 1. Consciousness. The things I'm about to say in this video will confuse a lot of you. It will come across as completely ridiculous to many of you. That being said, those are completely normal reactions. What I'll tell you is just watch until the end of this video. I don't expect to change all of your minds, but the great thing about bringing opposing ideas together is that even if you disagree with them, you come away from them with a better comprehension of why you do believe the things that you do. So worst comes to worst, if you think all of these ideas are ridiculous, that's fine, but at least you will understand your own position better. Our modern civilization is the most philosophically materialist ever. What that means is not what most people think it does, where we associate materialism with greed or status seeking. However, philosophic materialism is the concept that the world is fundamentally made out of atoms or things you can measure materially. It is opposed to idealism, or the idea that the world is fundamentally built off spirits or ideas. The irony is that idealism as well as materialism have become adjectives, and for idealism, it's a person who's unrealistic, shows that each of these philosophies have natural endpoints when applied to the real world. In our modern society, we only treat material things as if they're real. This is why we don't really take religion, anthropology, philosophy, art, culture, tradition, or any of that stuff seriously. It's completely normal for us to use economic or political systems to explain how the world works, but using religion or culture is a lot rarer. Materialism versus idealism is a philosophic battle that's been going on for as long as we've had philosophy. Aristotle or Plato were some form of materialism versus idealism, and it wouldn't surprise me if we had better records of them if this has been going on since Babylon or Egypt. That being said, we are by far the society in history which is the most materialistic. Even so, for materialistic thinkers like Aristotle or Epicurus from the ancient world, they did believe in spirits or the soul, which our society really doesn't. For both materialism and idealism, they run into natural philosophic issues, and in my worldview, I think both exist symbiotically. But for the materialistic worldview, the issue it runs into is that consciousness doesn't make sense. Human consciousness is something which you can't physically hold, but it's completely important and decisive to the human condition in that our conscious experience is the only thing we really have in life. This is why Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." As a society, we call this the hard problem of consciousness. The modern world doesn't even really attempt to craft a theory to explain consciousness. Thus, we kind of avoid it and put it in a mental box away from the rest of our attempts to explain the world. There's a thinker named Kuhn who developed this idea of paradigms in the 1960s. Or the different cultures develop different theories on how the world works. What happens is that this paradigm does a good job of explaining things in the beginning. Then, as decades or centuries pass and society gets more knowledge, or that paradigm is applied to the real world, you naturally see the intellectual flaws of that worldview. This gradually happens, and you can see it in how the scientific consensus from, say, 100 to 200 years ago is very different from what it is today, even though we've had the scientific method or the same tools for assessing the outside world intellectually for that whole time period. One of the mental ideas which really shocks me for how most people don't wrap their heads around it is that in the same way previous eras of history were wrong about very important things in their worldview, and this is true even as recently as the last 20 years, why won't we be wrong about very important things in our worldview today? The main way that people discover new paradigms is by seeing things in the last paradigm that they don't have an explanation for. The thing is that our current ideas about time, existence, progress, and more stem from Christianity. We're taking what we ourselves would say are irrational teachings of a religion without analyzing them. For example, the idea that time moves linearly comes from Christianity. Alternately, no one ever scientifically tested whether people are equal. It's a spiritual teaching from Christianity, though. The underlying framework of our worldview is something we don't even think about or analyze scientifically since it comes across as so obvious. For example, in the Middle Ages, when they found fossils of sea animals miles inland, they said that it was a trick by God to question their faith. In retrospect, we can see that this was total ideological cope, but they unironically believed that. It's similar to how people will unwittingly go through incredible mental contortions to protect their current ideological view, even in ridiculous situations, and they normally don't even realize that they're doing it. My job here isn't to make you believe in the esoteric tradition. It's to get you to the point where you can mentally empathize with why the most brilliant minds of centuries ago would believe in this sort of thing. The easiest way to do so is to show the weak points in our own worldview to hazard some humility. We can tell that materialism is not the whole world, given the post-World War II West is the wealthiest, safest, most hygienic, freest, fairest society in history, and its inhabitants are miserable. Look at the art or culture from our current society, and you can see that we're clearly not happy. The West is literally committing suicide as a society in every single way it would. We openly say we hate ourselves. Likewise, celebrities materially have everything they could want, but we all know celebrities don't have good mental health. What this shows is that the material isn't everything. You can materially have everything you want, but you're still missing something else important which drives you mad. Likewise, it's very clear that if you change the ideas in someone's head, that you can change their whole life. I'm sure a lot of you have stories about a deadbeat relative who was a total loser until they heard a message, or they had some reckoning which made them pull their life together. Alternately, when a country changes its religion or ideology without changing its material conditions, so much else changes. All of these arguments are super complicated and have thousands of pages that have already been written about them going back thousands of years. But again, in both of these cases, the material conditions stayed the same while the idea changes. This shows that ideas exist independently from material conditions, at least on some level. This is where the pre-modern esoteric worldview comes in. They believed that consciousness creates reality, in the opposite form of what modernity believes, in which we focus on the material to ignore consciousness. The ancients focused on consciousness first. They built a worldview around what the human condition is like through the lens of how we live it. I would like to hazard some humility here, and that there is a significant amount of evidence in physics that consciousness does actually change reality. We've found that particles move differently whether or not they're being perceived. There are a bunch of recent discoveries in physics which do suggest that consciousness does create reality. Keep in mind, a lot of our views on this stuff were never scientifically tested. It's just that we took them so much for granted we never thought about it. We never wondered about if consciousness does change reality because it so affronts our mechanistic materialist notions of how the world works. And I'm not an expert in physics, but all of these things are much more complex than we give them credit for. Our society confirms all our biases, so we don't look at this on a deeper level. And I would say don't take the science we have now as gospel, since history has shown the scientific consensus is frequently wrong. When the ancients discussed reality, what they're really talking about is how we as humans experience reality. Thus, dream life, or the things you see when you're tripping on psychedelics, were as real as the outside world was in their worldview. When ancients talk about demons or angels, those are things that exist because we see them exist, since reality is what we perceive. This is one of those things that's argument from definition, and Sitch from the Sitch and Adams podcast developed Sitch's law, that almost all debates are debates about a definition. In the modern worldview, reality is that which is replicable. Thus, dreams or things that we see spiritually or in hallucinations don't exist. Meanwhile, in the ancient world, they exist by definition. I understand where the moderns are coming from, where if you're dying in a dream, that doesn't mean you're dying in real life. But also, we do completely ignore these non-replicable sensations in modernity, but the problem is that they still do happen to us, and they're still there. These are things that do happen, and ignoring them means they don't exist, but it's a way of getting around not having to deal with information that our paradigm can't understand. I can understand the importance of having scientific rigor, but at the same time, don't get stuck in a cyclical argument. This is like the medievals saying that the inland fossils are a sign of God tricking them because their worldview doesn't understand, so they're going to put it in a box where they can ignore it. If spiritual phenomena doesn't exist, or conscious phenomena can't exist since the only things that happen by definition are not those things, then that's a cyclical argument. Nothing doesn't happen for any reason. Nothing in the universe is just silly details that don't serve some purpose. If you don't believe in the spirit world literally, I think we can all agree it's important to understand why humans would naturally see these illusions, even if that's all that they are. You can't just shove an entire aspect of the human condition under the rug since your theory can't explain it, but that's what our society and all societies to differing degrees do on this topic or whatever topic that society doesn't want to deal with. Now that we're at the point where we're willing to treat non-replicable phenomena of consciousness as real things, we've reached the point where the esoteric worldview starts to make sense. Even if we can agree that this stuff isn't real in the way that we define that word in our society, isn't it still interesting to see what's down there? Rather than being random or silly, we've found the nature of consciousness is actually quite ordered. People have been delving deeply into their own consciousnesses for thousands of years, and they develop systems to deal with them. The codification of what they found, in many cases, became religion. The further you go into the human soul, the crazier things get, but also they get more ordered. One of the most profound things I've read, which I've had to mull over for a long time, is something Itzhak Bentov said, that the natural order has a way of recycling all things. There are ways water, atoms, or oxygen is recycled. If consciousness exists, and we know it has to in some form, there has to be a way of naturally recycling it. So why not have an afterlife, reincarnations, or a spirit world? I made a video a few months ago about how the CIA had decades worth of research into the spirit world. They were able to get hundreds of people, and the vast majority of the people they worked with, to visit the spirit world in a replicable manner. Their assessment was that the science involved was accurate, and the independent military's assessment was that all the science the CIA did was correct. The Soviets also had their own research into this field at the same time, which came to the same result. Keep in mind, every previous era of history also believed in the spirit world with complete confidence. Even the most educated people until the start of the 20th century, like Isaac Newton, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Charles Darwin, or Queen Victoria, believed in the spirit world with complete confidence. What this suggests is that there is something here that we don't know about. Even if it's not materially real in the way we expect, shouldn't we at least check it out to see what's going on? Let's start going down the rabbit hole. Hi everybody, please humor me for a shameless plug, but you guys should check out my second channel called History 102, where we spend 1 hour explaining different historic time periods. And I do the podcast with Eric Torenberg, and we've gone through the fall of Rome, the World Wars, the Middle Ages, and our goal is to cover all of history. Peace. Part 2. The Secret Societies. Secret societies have had a significant impact on the history of the world. That sounds like a conspiracy theory, but this is something that we have very significant records with, and that all historians would agree with. The Masons being vital forces for the French or American revolutions are easy examples of this. Even the revolutionary or Marxist movements started out as secret societies to escape persecution by the government. You can look at how leftists covertly were operating in academia or other institutions, but as they gained power, using it to push Marxist aims, which they had the whole time. The World Economic Forum is a public example of a kind of association which can influence the world. Now imagine how many organizations exist like that secretly, or who at least keep a very low radar, which would be easy. I mean, to be frank, if I ran the World Economic Forum, I would try to make sure no one ever knew. If these kinds of groups existed in recent history, it's not insane to believe that they go back further, into societies where records are worse and it's easier to keep things hidden. In the Roman and Hellenistic periods, the known world followed secret mystery religions like the cult of Isis, Cybele, Mithras, the Bacchae, Dionysians, Orphism, or even early Christianity. These are large religions with millions of followers where we have an enormous amount of historical information about them, but they kept their teachings secret and underground. For a lot of these, we don't even know what they were doing even today. In the Middle Ages, if you look at the early Protestants or heretics like the Cathars, these started out as secret religious societies since the Catholic Church hunted down dissenters. As they gained more power, they came out publicly, but for centuries beforehand, they operated under the surface privately. Again, this is not how modernity likes to view the world, but this all shows that secret organizations can have very significant amounts of authority over the world and yet have very little outside form. We have an overwhelming amount of evidence for various esoteric mystic associations. This occurred around the world in every major civilization. Christ once said, "Do not throw pearls before swine." What he meant there is that there are secret teachings which the public in general is not ready for, but those who are more advanced should know. This is a principle seen around the world in which every major religion has an advanced esoteric mystic tradition, which is only shared by those who have reached a level of profound development, who are capable of handling it. This is something I think a lot of people can understand, but applying this principle to adults makes our society feel very uncomfortable due to the notions of equality we follow. Study after study, as well as just conventional wisdom, is that people are not equally intelligent or sentient. Imagine trying to explain the War of Spanish Succession, ship processing, or the most complex level of finance to the stupidest person you know. They would probably not even be able to comprehend what you were saying, leaving your explanation with a few key points that they might forget later. This is not pleasant, but it is reality. Ken Wilbur has written about spiral dynamics, or how different people or different societies have differing levels of consciousness in which they can't see the levels more advanced than them. For example, tribesmen from the Amazon can't mentally conceive of science since their frame of consciousness doesn't have objectivity. You see this play out over history and even among individuals. For example, we all know ideologues who take their ideology at complete face value without the ability to think about it. My friend Josh Doan, who is a fantasy writer, likes to say that you have a certain level of currency in your writing where you can get your audience to suspend disbelief for you up to a certain range. That being said, this is the point in writing the script where I realize I have to throw that out the window. But we have decades worth of research that psychics exist. Again, you can ignore this point and just watch the rest of the video, but Princeton professor Dean Radin has done a lot of work to show how some things statistically just don't make sense if people aren't psychic, in which the only explanation for lots of stuff is that someone is psychic. What his work found is that most people are only very passively psychic, in which they might guess cards a few percentage points higher than expected, which doesn't sound important, but is actually incredibly statistically significant if you operate at large enough scales of numbers. Meanwhile, 1% of the population has natural genetic psychic gifts. This is a genetic ability concentrated in a very small part of the population, which is not percolated to the rest. In the same way that there is a point in which only 1% of the population could speak language or comprehend abstract concepts. These people can do incredible stuff like share information remotely, gather knowledge about what would otherwise be impossible, see the future, among many other things. We have hundreds or thousands of public records of this, with people getting information that's otherwise impossible, including from the US and Soviet militaries. The US used this ability to locate military bases which would otherwise be impossible, or spy on Soviet weaponry. This makes me sound insane, but look it up. The records are there, and it's a skill that even the most advanced people can only do rarely. For example, with the best baseball players, they're only able to bat not that often. And we, for example, have gotten people to read statistically significant numbers in rooms on the other side of the country, but the further you get away from your home base that you're psychically seeing from, the more the world gets distorted. That being said, the chances of this stuff even happening once is literally statistically impossible. Humanity has constantly been evolving new skills over its history, whether the ability to think rationally, speak, do math, or dance. So why aren't there more mental abilities that we haven't evolved yet? Keep in mind, every single era of history besides ours agreed that these kinds of people existed. They just called them wizards, magicians, or witches. What the esoteric tradition existed to do is to create religion for these psychically gifted people. Once you see religion as developing institutions which can cater to the 99% and these secret associations for the 1%, the entire history of religion starts to make more sense. For example, for people who can't see this stuff, they're given moral frameworks that can make sense for their lives based off rituals and rules, since they themselves can't experience those, or at least only so rarely. Meanwhile, the esoteric is coded and hidden since only those who are physically capable of attaining it will understand what it's saying. It's a natural filter. We can see this in both Taoism and alchemy. In each case, they use riddles and paradoxes as a way to demonstrate complex philosophical concepts to people. They don't make sense until you've had the experience itself and then it clicks. For example, alchemy is supposedly about making gold, or Taoism and Orphism about attaining immortality, but the reality is that's not what they're about. Those are all codes for different things. For example, let's look at alchemy. Alchemy, for those who don't know, is a pre-modern philosophic process of trying to turn base metals into gold. This is complex, and here's a text wall, but making gold is supposed to be symbolic for attaining a state of spiritual perfection. Alchemy uses a bunch of complex systems and symbols in order to convey points. For example, water is symbolic for the nature of the soul. Splitting water apart means breaking apart the subcomponents of consciousness. The thing is that if you have these genetic abilities, you can supposedly feel what these psychological states are, and so water or gold have completely different meanings once you have attained the psychological states that they're symbolic for. An ironic thing is that Jordan Peterson has based a tremendous amount of his philosophy upon this tradition. The terms he uses and the underlying philosophy he has are all based off Hermeticism. For example, talking about the dragon of chaos, going into the belly of the whale, and saving your father are all concepts which stem from Hermeticism. Jung was obsessed with Hermeticism, and Peterson got his ideas from Jung. Peterson's idea that you need to face chaos, incorporating it into yourself healthily, is an alchemical idea. The thing is that the world, from the perspective of these esoteric traditions, is very similar across cultures. Everything I just said was believed across the major Eurasian civilizations, whether India, Europe, Babylon, Islam, or China. All believed that a small genetic group have these abilities to see the spirit world and commune with God directly, that there should be secret associations of those with symbolic knowledge to guide them. Once you get to the very highest levels, the world's religions teach very similar things. Houston Smith, the top thinker in religion from the 20th century, wrote a book called Forgotten Truth, which teaches the points that all world religions agree on. They all say that consciousness creates reality, that the world is an ordered spiritual place where all things are connected, that we should raise people's moral levels to be more like God. They believe in a soul which goes in and out of an afterlife. Also, that the universe is a more peaceful and meaningful place, with the trials and tribulations of our lives being the engine that drives a beautiful universe. All of them all describe God very similarly, of this state of attaining complete unity and peace apart from the division of our world. That being said, they start to diverge from that point. The CIA's researchers in the spirit world came to the conclusion that there are different geographic regions of the spirit world, like continents, one which looks more like Indian mythology and another which looks more like the Abrahamic and Western, and other areas that look more like shamanic mythology. Thus, with Eastern, shamanic, or Western religions, they all are tapping into what are authentic spiritual experiences, but they're going to literally different places. Then, as the religions get codified for the real world, changes become more apparent. This isn't to say the differences aren't important. For example, theologically, Islam and Christianity aren't that different, but in actual application, they have created vastly different societies. That being said, the world religions fight over what they disagree on and don't notice what they agree on. That being said, often world religions don't teach the things their followers think they do. The Christianity that a lot of people in the West have, especially the non-religious, is a series of mental tropes and images that don't often relate to the actual religion. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that God is an old guy with a big beard. The fathers of the old Catholic Church all agreed that the crazy stories of the Old Testament, like Noah taking all the animals in the world on a single boat, are symbolic. This is what Hinduism or Buddhism teach as well. Once Protestantism showed up, they started having to take the Bible literally rather than as the authors intended, with statements often being symbolic for deeper spiritual points, which the initiated would understand and contemplate, but not the common person. With the esoteric movements, and we'll be focusing on the Western esoteric tradition here, is that there are multiple paths you can take. We spoke beforehand about the mystery schools, but beyond that, there is left and right-handed magic. Left-handed magic is that which comes from trying to become like God. Right-handed magic is that when you submit yourself before God and letting Him channel Himself through you. Left-handed magic is black magic, which as you practice it gradually rips you apart, while right-hand magic is white magic, which is the opposite and has positive effects. If you want to look at pop culture, Sauron, Voldemort, or Darth Vader are all black magicians who lost their souls through doing this, while Gandalf or Jesus are white magicians. The ancient religion Gnosticism is an example of left-hand magic, in that the founding principle of Gnosticism is that man is a god who must realize his own divinity. The Catholic Church was seen in the Middle Ages as a bastion of white magic, protecting Christendom from evil and chaos. Hermeticism or alchemy can be used either for good or bad. That being said, this is not in contradiction with Christianity at all. The Church practiced this sort of stuff in secret. Lots of famous Christians were involved in this sort of thing, whether Isaac Newton, Roger Bacon, St. Augustine, and so many other figures who we view in a completely different light. Frankly, it's harder to find thinkers in the pre-industrial world who didn't dabble in the esoteric than those who did. Even people like William Shakespeare or the American founding fathers use loads of phrases and words that have symbolic meanings in these esoteric traditions. These secret teachings stemmed from ancient Egypt or Babylon. Hermeticism was based off the conflation of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, both of which were gods of wisdom. In the Norse tradition, their equivalent is Odin. Both Egypt and Babylon had very advanced religious philosophy. These traditions mixed with Orphism in the classical world. Orphism is a secret religion that dominated ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks saw thinkers who we see as philosophers, like Socrates, Plato, or Pythagoras, as prophets of the Orphic religion, which we interpreted in a very different light. An interesting segue here is that we've proven that these Orphics were consuming psychedelics at their secret religious retreats, which they weren't allowed to talk about publicly. In this book, this theory is pushed even further, where there's significant evidence that the Eucharist in the ancient and medieval church was a psychedelic. From a combination of evidence, records of how they made the Eucharist and people taking it, it sounds a lot like it was a psychedelic. These beliefs evolved into Hermeticism, Gnosticism, alchemy, and the early Christian church. This sort of mysticism became incredibly popular during the Islamic Golden Age, with the great thinkers of that age like Ibn Sina being obsessed with it. Through a combination of the Catholic Church and from Islam, it became popular in the West through the medieval and early modern periods. Alchemy was an art which evolved from Hermeticism, which was popular in both Islam and the pre-industrial West. We know that people can change their neurological structures more than we give them credit for. If you look at the brains of Indian holy men, due to years of spiritual practices, they literally have come to work differently from normal people. This is how they can do the incredible physical feats like walking over burning coals, standing on top of a pillar for years, or living in dark caves for years on end. The goal of these esoteric groups, and religion in general, is to change the neurological wiring of our brains into something better. Hermeticism and alchemy are supposedly based off the Emerald Tablet, which was the teachings of Hermes. It's public access now, and supposedly inside it is an encoded message on how to turn any substance into gold through the Philosopher's Stone. Much of Hermeticism and alchemy involves reading ancient texts to try to understand them on a symbolic basis. Which leads me to a major point where I do want to hazard caution, in that these ancient teachings can often devolve into intellectual masturbation over things that are basically silly. A lot of this can become very obsessive and masturbatory and autistic while reading ancient texts where it's unclear if the author is even correct or operating in good faith. And I have a lot of friends who are involved in this sort of thing, and I frequently tell them, guys, please calm down. Don't take everything you see here as complete gospel. And also, what I would say is that it's a natural tendency of historians to go native and fall in love with whatever time period they study. And my favorite era of history is the Middle Ages. So I've tried to be careful to avoid that, although I think it has happened to a certain degree. What I would say is that this worldview has flaws implicit in it in a way that's comparable to our modern worldview. And the issues that this worldview can get into is over specificity on things that are not specific, and assuming we have more knowledge than we have on these very subjective topics. Again, idealism ends up with having different flaws and pushed to its extreme than materialism. Where materialists can become very cynical and very greedy, idealism can just devolve into silliness and delusion. And the two need the other to balance the other out, because once you've removed too far from the material or the intellectual ideal worlds, you just run into gullible and naive silliness. Another natural outcome of pushing this philosophy is incredible egoism and arrogance among the people who do have the genetic ability to do this sort of thing. And if you want to see examples of this from history, look at the caste system in India, or Platonism, in which both of them are effectively creating a caste system where those who can see the spirit world at the top and everyone else. And I hate to be this blunt, but if you compare India versus Europe, because India is the society where these kinds of mystics took over everything and ran society in their image, where India stagnated once the priest class took over, while Europe, which went after empiricism and studying the outside world, they were the ones to take over the entire planet, to invent all the new technologies, and have all these innovations. So that shows that this kind of esoteric world isn't everything there is. And just because you're a level 12 battle mage who can talk to giant spirits doesn't mean that you're a more moral or a better person than someone who isn't. I think the organization that did the best job of dealing with this dichotomy is the Catholic Church, in which the pre-industrial Catholic Church had organizations for mysticism, like the Jesuits or Saint Teresa of Avila, and at the same time, you could socially promote yourself in their structure by just being a moral person and following their moral compass. And Catholicism was able to combine elements for people with this ability and normal people. Part 3. The Occult Worldview. One of my favorite books ever is The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. It's a history of the world from the perspective of these esoteric pre-modern organizations. They had constructed their entire theory of world history from the discoveries they made in the spirit world. It's remarkable to think there's this entire vision of the world, which had a tremendous amount of effort that was put into it for millennia, that normal people just know nothing about. If you read their narrative of prehistory, it's stuff like,
"Then Saturn killed the mother goddess. Angels came down and bred with women, creating the ability to think consciously. The sun god is at war with the forces of chaos. Hermes went down to Egypt and gave them wisdom."
It's so complicated that I can't even barely explain it here, but read the book if you want to know more. At the same time, though, they've built their entire mythology, which is a rationally consistent worldview. To be completely transparent, when I first read this, I thought, this is bullshit. I still have that feeling somewhat, but I did make a mental transformation which resulted in this making more sense. If I'm being totally honest as well, if you see a new religion that you're unfamiliar with, your first gut reaction is this is stupid, and the ancients would have thought that if they heard about modern science without. The thing, though, is that this isn't supposed to be what objectively happened, but rather what it felt like what happened. Also, keep in mind, these are explicitly symbolic, which the people involved said. For example, there was a cognitive breakthrough around 70,000 years ago called the Cognitive Revolution. With that, humans started to have culture, religion, abstract concepts, technological progress, and all that stuff. We can scientifically know that something neurologically probably happened, but for the humans who experienced that, it must have felt like they left the Garden of Eden. Suddenly, they were exposed to all these scary ideas like death, God, or moral standards. Likewise, it's possible that there were other events in our prehistory that were processed like this. For example, in the esoteric tradition, they say the breakthrough towards being alive and moving was the vegetal state being conquered by the animal state. This video is by nature very cursory, where there's an entire worldview built off these concepts with a tremendous amount of effort, thought into thinking about them. And I don't even pretend to be an expert in this topic. And if you want to know more, read more. My bibliography is in the description. I'm also not here to talk about the Eastern esoteric tradition. That being said, the Indian esoteric has interesting lessons that you see in the Western tradition. One of my favorite books ever is The Eye of Shiva by Amaury de Riencourt. It's about how ancient Hinduism has many similar concepts to modern physics, including reality being contingent upon how we process it, consciousness changing reality, space and time being able to rip apart, string theory, quantum physics, alternate dimensions, the universe being billions of years old, reality being a bubble, and more. This is something the discoverers of modern physics were deeply aware of, and that's why Oppenheimer quotes the Bhagavad Gita when the first nuclear bomb was detonated. What Amaury believes that since all things are connected, that by becoming more self-aware, we are capable of sensing our place in the universe. Imagine a cell in your hand being able to know intuitively the broader purpose it serves inside your hand, or its place in your body. Carl Jung writes about this further, giving an example of how artists were drawing things which looked exactly like what certain cells looked like under the microscope years before that was discovered by science. Thus, when these types of mystics are using their abilities, this is how they're gaining knowledge. That being said, this often creates knowledge biased towards the worldview of the mystic. Although, if you want to watch my video on science, this is also science's greatest flaw, as I explained through this text wall. Science does have an arbitration method based off empirical data, thus I will personally trust scientific data over a mystic, since there's no way to hold a mystic accountable to their knowledge, but I still think the mystic is vital and useful and a vital part of the human condition. In India, there were associations of priests and monks who would corroborate evidence from the spirit world to create a sort of mental map of what it looks like. This is how Hinduism developed. With both the Western tradition and with the CIA or Soviet research recently into the spirit world, they all find a map of the spirit world which is quite consistent. This being that there are higher and higher levels of abstraction. An example of this is Dante's 7 layers of hell. Once you move out from the earth, you see crazier and crazier stuff until you finally reach God. The medievals confused the spiritual universe for the actual universe and thought that heaven was literally above them and hell below them, rather than being spiritual symbolism. Even inside the Christian Abrahamic tradition, there were different gods in the esoteric spirit world. They were processed as angels, if positive, or demons, if negative. This is how devout Christians were studying the methods of the god Hermes. In the Abrahamic tradition, the role of white magic is to build unity with God himself. There are 7 planetary gods or archetypal principles which underlie the universe. These include Mother Earth, Mercury, Saturn, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, the Sun, and more. I once paid a researcher to develop an underlying map of the spirit world by corroborating all these mythic traditions into the different planetary gods. He came out of this saying I shouldn't pay him because it's basically an impossible task, but that Carl Jung had already done the best job you could with his archetypes. Jung found that the human stories focus upon shared narratives that you could see arising in different cultures around the world. These include the trickster, the dragon slayer, chaotic Mother Earth, the secret path of wisdom, the virgin birth, and many others. These archetypes manifested themselves across the world in different ways. Each also had their own natures. Mother Nature is that from which all rebirth and creativity stems. At the same time, she's chaotic, vengeful, short-sighted, and completely irrational. If you've lived in nature for long periods of time, you know that's pretty accurate to how the natural world works. Meanwhile, if you look at human female nature, you find that the positive of the feminine are caring, the ability to bring out the next generation, and providing stability for future growth, and irrational growth and kindness, while the negatives of the feminine are short-sightedness, the abdication of responsibility, chaos, and irrationality, and that matches pretty well with the archetype for how Mother Nature acts. And you wonder why things like this happen. This is why the ancients believed in archetypes. Mars, for example, is the chaotic force of bloodthirstiness and aggression. In the Iliad, Homer would say that Mars took the side over the Greeks over the Trojans in a certain battle, and what he meant by that is they fought more ferociously. How the pre-moderns viewed the world is that there are these archetypal forces which take over us. For example, with lust, or in the esoteric tradition, represented by Venus or her masculine form Lucifer, in the passions of lust we lose our rationality and humanity, consumed by this ancient biological form. In those moments, lust owns us. We don't own lust. A book that's really changed my worldview is A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, and he said the biggest philosophic difference between the modern and pre-modern worldviews is that modernity believes in a thing called the buffered personality, or that each human mind is different and rational and processes the world individually. Meanwhile, the pre-modern world viewed the human psyche as an ecosystem in which pathogens like bad ideas can enter, but also good ideas, and that psychology is collective, through which a certain population can have psychological plagues that are transmitted, or things like the seasons or astrological signs can affect human consciousness. So moderns view human consciousness as a bunch of discrete, rational, individual things, while in the Middle Ages, they viewed it as like a cell ecosystem in which someone's mind is constantly being permeated by outside forces. Jung took this idea from Plato, who had this through the idea of Platonic forms, that there are these perfect abstractions of which us on Earth are just imperfect copies. This sounds insane in the modern worldview, but to see examples of this, let's look at love. We look for the perfect archetype of our opposition, that being a male or female partner. We then see how actual people fulfill this archetype. The human race is perpetuated by the archetypal mating of the masculine and feminine. Aristotle found that human governments cluster around three systems, those being monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. He found that each of these collapsed for their own reasons relating to their greatest strength. 2,500 years later, this is still largely true. Thus, human government must fit inside these archetypes of potential forms of government. Natural laws are archetypes. We find that all material things are dependent upon these idealistic rules. We all have to follow the law of gravity, something we can't touch. Non-material principles, another one being the law of Darwinistic competition, dominate our whole lives. The archetypes also explain why you keep seeing similar patterns over history, why tyranny looks the same wherever it is in history, how the holy act similarly in different societies, how war remains while those who fight the wars change. You can see this in societies in which organic wholes like communism, Western civilization, or the stock market form through emergent systems. The stock market has a life of its own that no human can really control. Only through trusting in the archetype that is capitalism can we grow rich, while trying to control the process itself causes poverty and despotism. You can see that there is a spirit of Western civilization that operates through its architecture, values, or nations which struggle for their own life. Spengler writes about this a lot. This is something I'm not an expert in, so I can't speak at great length about, but I've heard that AI, as it shadow boxes different ways of organic learning, it ends up in a couple different of the same patterns being repeated again and again, which suggests that even organically, that thought fits into different archetypes that naturally form. I mean, you keep on seeing the same sorts of patterns and the same symbols being repeated in the natural world, which is something that you can look it up, and it's pretty crazy, with the Fibonacci sequence for seashells being an interesting example. And the ancients believed that symbols were a way God winked at us to show us that he was there, and there is a broader structure to the universe. One of my friends has a saying which I like a lot, which is, I don't believe in conspiracies, but I also don't believe in coincidences. And what that means is that this worldview which I share is that if you're seeing something, it's not, in most cases, because some evil cabal decided it. It's due to something like shared self-interest. But at the same time, if enough things happen in ways that are statistically implausible at the same time, it's probably not a coincidence. There's some underlying principle of the world, or you could say archetype, that you didn't know about. And we're constantly discovering that there are new theories to explain the world. One person would see as random coincidence, another person would see as some underlying thread that you didn't know about. And Jung developed an idea called synchronicity, which is that things that are related to each other or sort of similar happen at similar times in a manner which is comparable to string theory, or that different particles which are really far apart in the universe are mystically connected with each other. An example of a synchronicity would be if you met your new girlfriend the day you broke up with your last one, or from real history, how two great enemies and symbols of different schools in the early republic, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, died on the exact same day. When you're looking at a story like Hercules, what you're seeing is symbolic of man's struggle against nature. The dragon is symbolic of the forces of chaos, being a combination of all the things most dangerous to our monkey ancestors, being snakes, eagles, and fire. Thus, killing the dragon is fighting chaos, and this is why every society has myths about dragons and the kind of men who kill them. That being said, nested inside the dragon is a cautionary tale. Dragons almost certainly never existed in the form that we believed they did. In 1000 AD, there weren't these flying, fire-breathing dinosaurs in England. That being said, we have lots of medieval records of people seeing living dragons. A credulous person would say that since the archetype exists, so must the physical thing it's attached to. This applies to a lot of the concepts we're talking about here. An underlying principle to this entire worldview is that the spirit world is as messy and complicated as our reality. There are loads of different special interests, factions, planes of existence, and that sort of thing. In prehistory, shamans would venture into the chaos of the spirit world. What the Abrahamic religion supposedly did was find the order to the spirit world, with God being the greatest spirit. Thus, by establishing order in the chaos, what this gradually did was remove the importance of the spirit world to society, since it had already been superseded by the greatest spirit, that being God. There are a couple principles in Hermeticism which I find very interesting. One which we discussed before is polarity, or the idea that all things need an opposite to function. Day and night, love and hate, ocean and land, man and woman. Without its opposite, nothing exists, since there's nothing to contrast it to. Without evil, there would be no good. Without free will, there must be evil, since by opening humanity up to choice, you must allow good as much as bad. The second principle is the great chain of being. All reality stretches from the highest to lowest forms, or those which are most like God, and those like the devil at the bottom. If you're not religious, you can view God as symbolic for the force of the universe, which pushes against entropy, and the devil as entropy or chaos. That which results in decay or lower forms is evil, and that which results in reaching higher levels is more godly. Something C.S. Lewis has said many times is that hell is a petty small place. Heaven exists in the same place geographically, but dwarfs hell in size. Hell is being controlled by pettiness, while good is opening yourself up to God's plan and your place inside it. By removing your ego, you become one with the divinity of the world. This is the thing mystics have been searching for as long as we know. We align our spirits either with higher or lower frequencies. Our souls thus naturally guide us to either higher or lower forms. A person with a good mindset gradually improves their life and those of everyone around them. A person with a bad mindset does the opposite. Hermeticism believes that reality is a bunch of radio frequencies which transmit themselves outwards, God being the greatest of all of these in that God dreams up the universe. We live in God's dream. Another principle implicit in Hermeticism is the idea that there are these sympathetic connections between things. And so this is how the philosophy of magic works. For example, if you have a voodoo doll, that voodoo doll is mystically connected to someone it looks like. And so if you look at Hermes or Mercury, he has mystical connections between the personality trait Mercurial, the planet Mercury, the art of healing, the art of Hermeticism, and as well as the god Hermes himself. And so all of these things have mystical connections, and it's comparable to string theory, which says something that's almost exactly the same, that there are these connections between different particles in completely different places of the universe. So when you push one, the other one in a completely different area also gets pushed. The point of Hermeticism is to gradually become more like God. If God is dreaming the world, it's up to us to integrate with him. Hermeticism offers great power, and whether or not you use it for good or evil determines whether you practice white or black magic. The reason the Catholic Church kept a lot of this stuff under the covers is because they were scared of the general public getting power that they weren't morally ready for. There is the magic of priests and the magic of kings. Traditional religion is the magic of priests in that it exists to make you more pure. Hermeticism and Gnosticism are the magic of kings, and that their premier aim is to make you more powerful, and then you have the choice down the road whether or not you use it for good or bad. I'm going to say something which I think is going to trip a lot of you up, but since all the people who were in modern science were also studying the occult, whether Isaac Newton, Roger Bacon, Descartes, Galileo, and science is actually an extension of these studies, in that the scientific method was discovered by monks in the 14th century, and the principles under which science operated were discovered by people who were studying alchemy. And so what you could say is that modern science is a form of magic, in which magic operates under certain processes through which you attain results that would not exist without those processes based under a certain philosophy, is that science became such a powerful form of magic that it invalidated all the other kinds of magic. We're getting in really controversial territory that I know the moderns won't like. The idea in Hermeticism or alchemy is that the more advanced you get, the more you can change reality to what you want. If reality is a dream by God, and then you start dreaming too. This is why the pre-moderns believed in magic, in that they thought that certain people had psychic abilities. To explain how they saw magic, let's say that if a witch kills someone, the way that would work is that she would cast a spell, and then her target drowns the day after. We would see this as a coincidence. God or magicians act through the universe itself. This means that it's basically impossible to disentangle whether magic is effective or not. A point I want to be clear about is that basically everyone in history except us believes in magic unquestionably. Even if you go to Africa today, it's taken completely for granted that magic is real. One of my good friends was an anthropologist who lived in rural Cambodia for years. The people there would literally see spirits and magic in their daily lives. Even as late as the 17th century, scientists believed in magic unquestionably. In the pre-modern world, we have loads of reputable, educated people writing about seeing magic, fairies, miracles, and all that kind of thing. Part 4, Conclusions. I'm frankly not sure what people are going to do with this video. I'm not sure what the application for all this ancient knowledge is in our day and age. I do think that there is something in that even if this all turns out to be completely wrong, it's important to have this knowledge and paradigm in the back of our heads as a lens through which to understand the world. For example, I am not a communist, and I in fact hate communism, but on a very, very frequent basis, I use intellectual tools Karl Marx developed. I think the reality is that the next paradigm that will develop is a mix of our current scientific worldview with traditional religions and some mysticism like this. I don't think this old worldview is perfect or infallible, as you can also see with modernity steamrolling the peoples who believed this sort of thing. That being said, our current worldview isn't enough. That's more and more obvious as each day passes. The fact, which I talk about in this video, is that we have some of the worst mental health ever in history as our society commits suicide, tells me that we need to figure our stuff out now. My hope is that people wiser and more intelligent than I will be able to parcel through the useful information in this video from the babble to make something that can help society. In a cold, sterile, depersonalized society, wouldn't having a spiritual tool for self-discovery be incredibly good? I think in the seeds of these forbidden ancient teachings might be nuggets of knowledge that can save our dying society. Keep in mind the West has already had 2 revolutions stemming from discovering lost knowledge, those being the Renaissance and Reformation. We need some white pills and things to hope for in these dark times.